In this lesson, we're going to explore the process of creating and applying a creative look to your images in a way that maintains the original image quality of your raw footage. So I'm going to demo things here on this particular shot, which is, as far as I know, probably raw from the camera. I haven't applied any look to it. This is just some stock footage that we're working with here for the purpose of the lesson. And the first thing that we have to do before we actually apply any creative look, as we've already talked about in the order of operations lesson, is to neutralize the image here. Right now, the shadows are pretty lifted, the highlights are pretty clipped, the color balance is looking a little bit funny. So before we get creative with it, we just want to bring this to a more neutral starting point. And I'm going to start simply by assessing this image and then determining which variables I need to adjust. So we'll start by addressing the shadow levels because they're really quite lifted. Again, if we go back into full screen, you could just see based on your eye how bright the shadow areas are, and that's not really that natural looking, so that's not a good starting point for us. So I'm going to grab my shadow slider, my lift here, and just drag it to the left just until I feel like it's looking better to my eye. So we're going to go to full screen here, and that's looking much better. Could probably back it off just slightly, but before I do that, I'll bring up the midtones because that tends to bring up some of the shadows too, while also just bringing back some more detail in our subject's face here. So here's our before and after. That's already starting to look better as far as contrast is concerned. I could tell that these highlights in the background are pretty clipped, so there's no need really bringing down the overall highlight value. That's just going to make those look muddy, so I'm going to leave that as is. But before we go any further, I am going to still push around our general color balance, specifically in the mid-tone range. Again, if I'm looking at this, the colors are pretty neutral as far as the shadowy areas here. The highlights are pretty bright white. The mid-tones are leaning a little bit green to my eye, so I'm going to push a little bit of blue, sort of magenta in there, and just play around with it here until I find something that's looking a little bit more natural to me. And keep in mind, sometimes when you're neutralizing your image, it will start to look a little bit less saturated. If the image looked really saturated while the color balance was shifted in one way, and then you pull the color balance in the opposite direction, it's often a requirement that you then add some saturation back in. So if we want to, we can do that. I don't think I need to at this stage. Then I'm going to look at the shadow areas here, and I'm noticing they're turning a little bit blue, a little cooler than I'd like, so I'll add a little bit more warmth here to the image, but I'm trying to avoid pushing it anywhere green because this image seems to skew a little bit green naturally. So I'm kind of going warmer, but more toward the red-orange side of the spectrum as opposed to the blue-green. So let's take a look at where we're at so far. Here's our before and after. And that's looking certainly much better. If we wanted to, we can continue to play around with this. Maybe we would turn up the saturation just a touch. We could take the highlights and cool them down just a little bit, just to kind of give it a little bit more color contrast in the image. And somewhere like this is now looking pretty good as a neutral starting point. So at this point, we're basically ready to start stylizing the image and applying a creative look. But before we do that, we again just want to look at the image and assess what it really needs, because we don't want to just start pulling and pushing colors around arbitrarily. We want to be really purposeful with the corrections. So looking at this image right here, my instinct is maybe to do kind of a bleach bypass look. I think that would look really cool because we're in a city environment and there's already a strong degree of contrast in this image. So a bleach bypass look, which is going to be pretty desaturated, will probably work well for a shot like this. So let's assume that's the look that we're going to apply. We've already created our base grade. I'm going to create another node here. That way, any creative looks that we want to try, we can just do on a separate node and then turn them on and off without affecting our base grade here, which is basically going to be set in stone now. And if you're working on another software like Adobe Premiere, or if you're in Final Cut Pro, you can simply stack color correction effects on top of each other as opposed to using nodes. So it's basically the exact same workflow. But what I'm going to do first and foremost here is adjust our contrast even more. So bleach bypass looks are known for their heavy contrast. I'm going to use my contrast slider down here. I'm going to crank it up pretty heavily. And I want to push the highlight areas even further, so I'm going to drag that up a little bit. And now we've added a strong amount of contrast to this image already. So this is before and after. This is the whole image before and after, and then just with our most recent corrections. So obviously this is now a pretty heavy, strong look, and it's really saturated because as you add contrast, your saturation levels tend to go up as well. But obviously this is just a starting point for us. So the next thing I'm going to do is cool down the image. Bleach bypass look is known for its cool, sometimes greenish tones. So I'm going to pull the gamma down here a little bit cooler. That's the midtones. And the reason I started with the midtones, by the way, is just because I think the shadow areas and the highlights, as I mentioned before, are already pretty neutral. I'm finding a lot of the color detail that needs to be pushed is generally in the midtones for this image. So let's go back here to our gamma setting. Let's just pull this as far as we're really comfortable with. And that's starting to look really cool. Maybe I'll back off of the blueness here in the shadows and just push the shadows a little bit warmer, or perhaps a little bit more to green, just so we don't live too much in this blue color wash territory that might over stylize the image. And then again with the highlights, those are looking pretty solid, but I'm just going to neutralize them by adding a touch of magenta, because they were pulling a little bit toward the green side of the spectrum before, and now that's what this node is doing, which is looking pretty cool. I'm going to add another node, or I could have done this on the same node, and now I'm going to simply desaturate the image. So now if we go full screen, that's sort of where we're at. Let's look at our original image. Let's look at now where we're at with that desaturated look. And honestly, this could really be a final look, I think, for me personally. I think that's looking really strong, really bold. If we wanted to further stylize it, I could add one more node here. And because I've already desaturated this image and now we're doing this on a different node, any corrections I do to lift, gamma, or gain are going to be that much more pronounced, because now we're applying it on top of the desaturated image. So let's just push our midtones just a touch cooler again, and our highlights as well. Let's go even for a cooler, sort of bleaker look. And then maybe I'll crank up the saturation just a touch, just to sort of bring some of that blue color really out and make it pop. And now here we go as sort of a before and after. And this is the correction that we just did. So that's where we were at with our first bleach bypass look. And then this is with the additional node on top of it that cools it down a little bit more. And I really like that. I think that's a solid final look. You could keep playing with this all day and trying different looks. Obviously, you could go in a different direction and stylize this image to be much warmer, or to have a totally different sort of vintage aesthetic, or whatever you'd like. But that's really up to you in terms of your creative intent with the image. The main thing that you should really take away from this lesson, though, besides following the order of operations, which is so critical, is that you want to use as few steps as possible and as few corrections as possible to get to your end result, especially if you're working with compressed footage from a DSLR or some other mirrorless camera. And the reason being is every time you create a color correction on your image, it slightly degrades the image quality. You don't really notice it when you're doing it in very subtle ways and you're just making these minor tweaks. It's never really visible to the human eye. But if you were to push your shadows really way too far in one direction, or your highlights too far in another direction, your image is going to start falling apart, because it only has so much color information in that file to work with. So whenever you're stylizing your image, always start with the smallest possible correction that you can. Apply that to your image. If you need to push it a little further, just add those little incremental steps until the image is looking exactly the way that you like it, and then you're not at risk of over stylizing the image and degrading the image quality overall.